Tēnā reo, rau rangatira mā. Prestigious people, speakers of note, chiefs, one and all. Nā tangata whenua o tēnei rohi, tēnā koutou katoa. I acknowledge the Indigenous people of this land and greet you all in Te Reo Māori, the language of New Zealand's Indigenous people. And I especially greet you, Auntie Joy. I get the feeling that you shower inspiration on your community on a regular basis as well. Nā mihi ki te rangi e tū nei. Nā mihi ki te whenua e tā koto nei. Nā mihi ki nā mea katoa. Greetings to the sky above, greetings to the land below, greetings to you and all things. Thank you very much for the invitation to come and speak with you all today, and Lord Mayor for the hosting role you're playing in the very kind and generous introduction. And can I start by also welcoming the work of the Australia and New Zealand School of Government and what you do in support of public policy development in both our countries. And surprisingly to me, rather a lot of you have come to hear me talk about that subject matter today. Can I start though by apologising? Of course, best laid plans had me joining you here in Melbourne in March, and that was obviously unsuccessful. You did, however, have, at that time, our longest-serving female Member of Parliament and now High Commissioner, the Honourable Annette King, fill in for me at that time instead. She is what I call a mentor and friend, or a more technical turn of phrase, she is my political spirit animal. And so, Annette, thank you very much for your representation at that time. You have asked me to speak today about why good government matters. Now, the first premise that I would like to offer in response to this topic is a relatively simple one. Good government matters because government affects everything. This in itself is something that perhaps we take for granted. I still remember my first election as a candidate. I ran in a traditionally conservative seat in rural New Zealand, but it was my old hometown. Now, near the conclusion of the campaign, I was walking down the main street of town when I came across an old school friend's sister. We stopped briefly to chat. She asked me what I was up to now. Once I overcame the small blow this created, given she clearly had no idea I was attempting to run for office in a matter of weeks, I tried to pivot towards a conversation about the election. That, she said. I don't think I'll bother voting. It doesn't really have anything to do with me. Second blow. A woman roughly my age who firstly wasn't interested in politics and secondly had very little interest in trying to be. This crushing, if not edifying experience happened over 10 years ago, but it could have happened yesterday. We have an impact on people's daily lives, for better or for worse, whether they know it or believe it. We make decisions that impact on their environment, on their jobs, on their wages, on their healthcare, and that's why good government has always mattered. But in an environment where indifference can and is quite easily turning into distrust, it matters even more. A quick scan of the horizon and we see that increasingly voters see their governments as not necessarily hearing what their interests are, or at worst, working against their interests, even in long-established democracies. Now, that may not be a new phenomenon. Politicians have long been the focus of derision. But what is new is the increasingly noisy environment that we all operate in. Fake news, fragmented interest groups, and multiple sources of news and information that people increasingly distrust. It's an environment made for shock politics, where only the noisy or the surprising are heard. The result? Around the world, democratic values and institutions are under threat in a way that many of us never expected to see in our lifetimes. Nationalist sentiment that closes off the possibility of countries working together is surging. Authoritarian movements and regimes are on the rise. Norms that we in New Zealand and Australia perhaps take for granted, the rule of law, the peaceful transfer of power, freedom of expression, are being challenged in new and explicit ways. These trends are possible because large numbers of people believe, rightly or wrongly, that their leaders are failing them. Now, unfortunately for us as political animals, I don't think we can afford to sit back and claim that we're simply misunderstood. Not when we look at the context or environment in which all of this dissatisfaction has emerged. We can start with the state of many developed economies. Now, while they continue to grow in overall economic terms, if not as quickly as they once did, they have too often failed to share the benefits of that growth. In many countries, while the very wealthiest have grown consistently wealthier, the rest have seen little or no real rise in their incomes or their living standards over decades. Inequalities that deepened with the great deregulating reforms of the 1980s and 90s have become a permanent feature of these economies, not a brief moment of pain. It certainly was the experience in New Zealand. As a small country, we are often at the forefront of global trends because we can move faster and sometimes further than our larger counterparts. And that was evident in the way that we embraced and sometimes pioneered the free market reforms of the 1980s and 90s. Starting in 1984 through to the 1990s, we removed regulations that were said to hamper business. We slashed subsidies, we transformed the tax system, dramatically cut public spending, massively reduced welfare benefits paid to the sick and those caring for children and the unemployed. Now, we can argue whether those regulatory reforms were necessary, but regardless, the numbers and outcomes, they speak for themselves. Within 20 years, my country lost its status as one of the most equal in the OECD. While incomes at the top doubled and GDP grew steadily, incomes at the bottom stagnated, and child poverty more than doubled. Now, I was a child back then, but I remember clearly how society changed. I remember nothing of Rogernomics, of course. I was 5. I was not the Doogie Howser of politics. But I do remember the human face, especially the kids who didn't have the basics. Now, this experience is not New Zealand's alone. It happened in many countries, often with deeper inequalities and more persistently stagnant real wages. And the change hasn't always been reversed yet. In fact, more recent trends have added new dimensions to the problem. The financial crisis of a decade ago did not turn into another Great Depression, thankfully, but it has led to ongoing upheaval in the global political economy. High debt and prolonged low interest rates have inflated asset values, widening inequalities in new ways. Most obviously for countries like Australia and New Zealand, booming housing markets have put home ownership out of reach for a growing number of young people, especially when coupled with the debt many accumulate trying to further their education. That same generation is now facing the prospect of new challenges, climate change and digital transformation, putting people out of work now and in the future. And just to add fuel to that already somewhat grim picture, new forms of media and communication are changing how we understand what is happening to our societies and how we connect with each other. This change has opened up the world in one sense, but it's also had the opposite effect of making us more distant at times, more entrenched. Stunningly, our most connected generation in New Zealand, our young people, have also been found to now be our loneliest. In the face of this fragmentation and disillusion, what does good government look like? Not for us, but for the very people who are turning away from us. Now, I've already mentioned one potential answer to this question. In recent years, we have seen politicians and governments of all stripes respond to the stresses and challenges I've outlined by turning inwards. Domestically, some have chosen to reject the independent and expert public service and the possibility of a mutually respectful and diverse nature. And looking beyond their borders, some have rejected the international institutions that they paint as responsible for both economic and cultural problems when they aren't necessarily at fault. So this is one answer that is available to politicians and that some are signing up for. After all, fear and blame is an easy political out.
As I say though, while I understand how we got to this point, I completely reject that as an answer. Because there is another response. Instead of turning inwards, we can improve the institutions that have helped hold together this long period of global peace that we live in. Instead of austerity measures that only stretch the rich-poor divide, we can offer meaningful support, and more than just financially, to those at the bottom. Instead of tearing down what works about our societies, we can build the system back up. We can acknowledge the areas where public policy hasn't met the challenges of economic change, and we can do better. One of the ways we can do this is simply by widening our idea of what prosperity means. Because if a country has been growing economically for 30 years, yet large numbers of its citizens haven't felt the benefit, is it really moving forward? If a country has a relatively high rate of GDP growth, but is neglecting the things that we should all hold dear, like the health of our children, a warm, dry home, mental health services, or rivers and lakes that we can swim in, then can it really be said to be improving? This year in New Zealand, we tried to push back on the old orthodoxy, and we introduced our first Wellbeing budget. We didn't abandon the previous approach to public finance, we widened it. We said not only what will be the most conducive to economic growth, but also more fundamentally, what will do the most to improve the lives of New Zealanders? What will help them to pursue lives of dignity and purpose? We embedded wellbeing at every stage of the creation of the budget, from setting priorities to analysing proposals and spend, to making the inevitable trade-offs that come with the privilege of being in government. Now, this is not a concept that we came up with ourselves. For some time now, the OECD and the IMF have urged countries to look beyond economic indicators and the government's balance sheet to define success. Our own Treasury has been preparing the groundwork for it too by developing a wide range of measures of living standards, taking into account social and environmental factors as well as traditional financial ones. After all, surely economic growth cannot, or at least should not, be a means to an end in itself, but rather the foundation for wider progress, including greater equality. At this point, everyone usually wants to know what a wellbeing budget actually means. All the talk about getting beyond GDP is well and good, but what does it mean in practice? Well, let me give you the clearest example I can: child wellbeing. New Zealand is a developed country where most people enjoy relatively high living standards in global terms. It has been clear for decades that this cannot be said of a significant proportion of New Zealand children. Now, there are obviously different measures around poverty, but to take one of them, which measures poverty after housing costs have been taken into account, well, on that measure, about 250 New Zealand children lived in poverty in 2017 and 18. Another measure, known as material deprivation, also paints a bleak picture. Now, income measures, they tell us about how families are doing relative to their peers. But material deprivation, it tells us how many families lack the basics, like having a couple of pairs of shoes for school or a warm heater in the family home. And on these, we also do poorly. Now, clearly this is fundamental to a country's well-being. Children who are quite literally the future of New Zealand, who have done nothing to choose their situation, are in an unacceptable hardship. And the effects are obvious on our health system, where diseases that we should have abolished years ago are taking root again, like rheumatic fever. On our education system, where a tale of underachievement is plainly tied to legacies of social and economic inequality. On our justice system, where the worst off kids are often the first to arrive as adults. Now, we can have both an economic or a moral argument as to why this needs to be addressed, or we can simply say that either way, it isn't right. We talk about New Zealand being a great place to raise a family, and it is, but instead, New Zealand should be the best place in the world to be a child. So child wellbeing was one of the 5 focus areas for our first wellbeing budget. Now, before budget day arrived, we passed legislation to make sure that governments now and in the future are held to account for decisions that have impacts on children living in poverty.
The Child Poverty Reduction Act, which I have to say was passed with all but one Member of Parliament voting in favour, ensures transparent reporting on progress against published targets during the budget each year. For us, that has meant setting ambitious 10-year targets to halve child poverty in New Zealand.
And 3-year targets to significantly reduce the rates. Now, the Act itself, the law itself, doesn't set out how government achieves those goals. That bit is up to us as politicians. So in our first year, we introduced a families package, giving a significant income boost to more than 384,000 families in need. It includes a universal child payment in year one, a winter energy payment, and an extension to paid parental leave. At this year's budget, we made a crucial change to our benefit system, indexing the main benefit rates to average wage increases, which will halt the drift between the two that has grown for decades. It is estimated that about 329,000 individuals and families will be better off as a result. Now, indications are that due to that collection of policies, by 2020 and 2021, we will reduce the number of children in poverty by between 50,000 and 74,000 children on the after housing cost measure. And it was a wellbeing approach that supported those initiatives and those outcomes. Let's take another example, though, one that's also dear to my heart: mental health. New Zealand's neglected mental health and addiction services are no surprise to anyone at home. They've been reported on for years. Our suicide rate is devastatingly high. Last year, a wide-ranging inquiry into mental health and addiction revealed that we needed a whole new approach to mental health and addiction in New Zealand. And we had the mandate for it because you'll be hard-pressed to find anyone in New Zealand who hasn't been affected by suicide, mental health, or addiction issues. As it stands, our mental health and addiction services are often orientated to those with the highest needs. People with emerging issues or mild to moderate mental health or addiction needs are largely our missing middle. Now, this comes at a huge cost to individuals and families, and if you want to add on the list, to the economy as well. It's estimated that in 2014, the economic cost of serious mental illness alone was $12 billion, or 5% of GDP. And that's one of the reasons why we made mental health a centrepiece of our wellbeing budget, which included a more than $1 billion investment in New Zealanders' mental health. Our aim, in short, is to transform our approach so that within 5 years, every New Zealander who needs it has access to a range of free services that support and maintain their mental well-being. Now, this new layer of services will put trained mental health workers in doctors' clinics, Māori health providers, and other health services so that when people reach out for help, when they go and see their GP or attend their local clinic, help will be there in the form of a trained mental health worker who is immediately available. Now, all of this responds to the idea that New Zealanders' wellbeing must be the foundation of our public spending. One more example, briefly. The aspirations of Māori are another priority in our wellbeing approach. Now, here once more, despite the Treaty of Waitangi, partnership between Māori and Pākehā New Zealanders, despite several decades of settlements for land taken and promises betrayed, a legacy of inequality continues. Now, our wellbeing budget prioritised new and empowering approaches through greater investment in the flagship Whānau Ora program, which supports Māori to determine their own needs and desired wellbeing outcomes, through investments in our Māori health workforce, employment programs, and through targeted and culturally relevant support for prisoners, far too many of whom are Māori. Now, at the same time, we have an aspiration that basic te reo Māori, the language, will be spoken by 1 million people in Aotearoa by 2040. So we've put substantial new resources into Taurāwhiri, the Māori Language Commission, Te Reo Rāri teachers, and more funding for Māori broadcast media. After all, if the country has a 2.6% GDP growth rate, but its Indigenous people aren't thriving, are we truly in good health? But let's be honest, our wellbeing challenges cannot be solved in one budget. You'd even question whether or not they could be solved in 10. That wasn't a re-election pitch. Public investment is a powerful lever for change, but it is only just one after all. We also need to embed the idea of well-being in the heart of our public service, how it works, what it prioritises, who joins and leads it. That's why earlier this year we announced that we would refocus the New Zealand public service to deliver enduring change, more strongly focused on improving the current and future well-being of all New Zealanders. Now, the changes that we're making in New Zealand are not far from many of the key themes identified in the early stages of your ongoing independent review of the Australian public service, including strengthening culture and leadership, increasing flexibility and capability, and a focus on working collectively. Now, that doesn't mean that our current system in New Zealand is broken. In fact, our public service has a strong international reputation, and New Zealand is ranked second overall in 38 countries assessed on central civil service performance in the 2019 International Civil Service Effectiveness Index, not nearly as widely publicised as it should be. Closer to home, the 2018 Kiwis Count survey, published only weeks ago, shows New Zealanders have increasing trust in the public service. Satisfaction with the provision of services is at a record high. So we're not embarking on the biggest reforms to the statutory framework of our public service in more than 30 years for nothing. We're building on the great service we have, but giving it the flexibility it needs. And why? Because we know we can do better. We know that we can build a more modern, agile and adaptive public service, and we know the importance of the constitutional role of our public service. So we're affirming this role for current and future generations in new legislation. Just a few weeks ago, our government announced the most significant changes to the New Zealand public service since the State Sector Act of 1988. This will be repealed and replaced with a new Public Service Act, and it will underpin a modernising of the service, all with the aim of making it easier to tackle some of the biggest challenges facing the government of the day. After all, one department dealing with one part of the problem at a time can't fix complex issues like breaking the cycle of poverty and domestic violence, or planning for climate change, or providing more effective mental health services. They're issues that don't fit neatly into a box, and we can only seriously tackle them with a whole-of-government approach. And that's why, under these changes, boards made up of chief executives from relevant government agencies will be established to tackle cross-cutting challenges. Now, these boards, or joint ventures, will be accountable to a single minister. They'll receive direct budget appropriations, and public servants from across the sector will be deployed as required. Now, one current example of this is the way that we're working to prevent and respond to family and sexual violence. This was also a major feature of the Wellbeing budget. Not only did the government deliver the largest single investment into this area, but we also delivered a new way of working. We delivered a package that cut across 8 different portfolios: the Attorney General, Corrections, Courts, Health, Justice, Child Welfare, Police and Social Development. But we know that we need more than structural change. As our Minister of State Services, Chris Hipkins, has said, the shift to a single unified public service approach will also be complemented by cultural change, with the new Act acknowledging that a spirit of service to the community is fundamental to the public service. A unified public sector around common purpose, principles and values is crucial, and we believe that we can encourage that practically by making it easier for public servants to move seamlessly through the public service as a whole, something that's not quite possible now. Building trust, though, also means a strengthened public service that supports the government's commitment to stronger Māori Crown relationships, helping to improve outcomes for Māori and the Indigenous people of our country. And we want, on top of that, a more diverse and inclusive public service, one that reflects ultimately the communities that we serve. Now, none of this will be sudden change. As I said before, New Zealand's public service is in pretty good shape, so these changes will be carefully phased and managed, and the legislative process will run into mid-2020. But all of this, of course, is part of a much wider goal, building a public sector that can help build good government. But as is so often the case in this sphere, the buck ultimately starts and stops with us, the politicians. As leaders globally, we are facing a rising tide of public suspicion towards government, a sense that we've left the material differences between us stretch beyond fairness, and as a result, there are signs of life in old ideologies. But if we begin at home, if we broaden our idea of good government and act with a sense of fairness, of guardianship, and even kindness, of what we call in New Zealand manaakitanga and kaitiakitanga, then I absolutely believe we will make headway on these challenges. But we won't succeed unless we apply these same values globally. And for countries like New Zealand and Australia, that means prioritising international rules and norms that work for all countries. It means encouraging trade, not retreating behind protectionist barriers. Trade that means jobs and livelihoods, but also are shaped by an open, honest dialogue with our communities. And here I do think Australia and New Zealand can be examples. We share a strong commitment to the rules-based international trading system that's currently under such strain, and I acknowledge and endorse Prime Minister Morrison's call for countries to mend and not end this system and to reject the idea that trade is a zero-sum game. But we can also enhance our expectations of the trade agenda. If we want to bring people with us, trade agenda also needs to lift labour and environmental standards and prove that they too can respond to the very issues that they are accused of ignoring. Times may be challenging, but I absolutely believe politics can be a place for change, disruption, and ultimately a force for good. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Prime Minister Ardern was, I think it's fair to say, backstage most looking forward to this part of the evening, which is where she got to hear from you. And you've been terrific in sending in questions via that Slido service. So remember, you can always go back there and vote for the question you want to hear asked or submit your own. Thank you for a terrific address and for one that really goes to the heart of how much trust and faith you still have in democratic institutions, in the institution of government, and I guess in our best selves to sort of get past the period that we're in right now. But we really are in a very strange retreat from the centre and a fleeing, if you like, to the margins and often the extremes, no more horribly represented than in New Zealand. Have you reflected long and hard on why that is?
Yes, and even before the terrorist attack in New Zealand, it struck me that we were operating in an international environment where increasingly there's this common theme of fear. You know, whether you look at the digital transformation that developed economies are facing and the insecurity that's creating financially for people. When you look abroad and see outcomes overseas through votes like Brexit and conversations around migration, and what underpins all of this is the sense of fear. The sense that people don't have the level of security that they perhaps feel, perhaps somewhat nostalgically, they once enjoyed. And we have choices as politicians. You know, in a political environment, you can either choose to capitalise on that fear, stoke it, and politically benefit from it, or you can run a counter-narrative. You can talk about hope. You can talk about solutions to the problems that we have to admit many of us, political beings, have been a part of. We have to acknowledge where we've failed and demonstrate how we can rectify the institutions that may underlie that.
Do you see those arguments and those discussions starting to turn the ship around, if I can put it that way? Because just for example, in the last 24 hours, we've seen quite the opposite in the United States with extraordinary language and rhetoric that I really don't think many of us have seen in our lifetime. Perhaps those of us who go back to World War II might have some memories of that. But do you see any evidence of that sort of logic working?
I see hope every day. I'm an absolute optimist. If you spend 10 years in opposition, you have to dig deep. You have to dig really deep for that optimism, but it's there. And I've seen humanity in the darkest of spaces. I think probably, in the wake, for instance, of March 15th, if there was ever an environment where you would expect that it would be at least justified for a community to hold anger and to hold a sense of extraordinary injustice, it was that moment. And yet, 24 hours after, when I travelled to Christchurch and I walked into a small community space where in that room were leaders from the Muslim community across Canterbury who the day before had been in the mosques that had been attacked, who were no doubt utterly traumatised by that. And as I sat and waited for them to utter their first words, I had an anticipation of what might come. And yet, when they opened their mouths, they expressed love and sympathy and compassion for New Zealanders. And that to me was the most extraordinary thing. So if I can sit in that environment and hear that kind of response in the face of something so extraordinary, I have a deep faith in humanity, a deep faith.
I want to ask you something more about the Christchurch shootings. One publication said of your, it seemed at the time, unusual empathy and warmth with the affected families and the way you conducted yourself in the aftermath of that. The quote was, "Jacinda Ardern just proved typically feminine behaviour is powerful." Is that how you see it? Is there an inherently feminine way of holding power?
There's a human way of holding power. And I'd like to think that was just... I think it's instinctive when you're mourning with someone to reach out in that way. It just felt to me like a human response, but perhaps I'd add another layer to that. It was a Kiwi response. At that time, all I was doing was mirroring exactly what was happening around the country.
Were you surprised by the surprise at your response? The fact that globally there was this surprise at how you conducted yourself?
I was saddened by it. Shouldn't have been noteworthy.
And when President Trump asked you how his country could help you in the wake of the massacre, you told him you wanted sympathy and love for all Muslim communities. Has he done that?
You'd be best to ask the Muslim community within the United States that question. It's for them to judge.
Did you feel that he answered your call?
Again, I'm not the one to judge that. I'm not a member of the community. I'm not the one having those experiences in that context. It would be for them to answer. I'm never one to answer on anyone else's behalf.
A lot of questions have been coming in on the issue of Australia and constitutional recognition, and you referenced in your remarks the Treaty of Waitangi and what that achieved, but also what it hasn't and where the inequities are still. But from the perspective of a country that has a treaty with its First Nation peoples, are there any lessons for us here in how we can start down the path of constitutional recognition for our Indigenous people?
Again, as someone from a country with an imperfect record, loath be it for us to ever tell any other country how to conduct itself, because we have not been a picture of perfection by any stretch. And for us, of course, our focus is ensuring that the treaty is a living document, that we on a daily basis are recognising and living its principles and demonstrating that in the relationship that we have. So we're not ones to lecture. We're just ones to focus on some self-improvement. We've got a lot of work to do.
Let me press you a little on that, because that's a question that's come through again and again, and it's one that clearly the room would love to hear some reflection on. So let me present it to you in a way that might be easier for you to answer, because no one's asking you to lecture. But, for example, when we saw in the aftermath of Christchurch that extraordinary vision, I hope you saw it too, of the school kids doing the haka outside of the synagogue, Māori kids, and then white kids, and then other kids, and they were all in there doing it together, and it was their dance.
Or a mum speaking to their Māori at the beginning of their addresses.
Their dance and their language, and something they all mutually owned. How do you get to mutual ownership?
Well, I think we have a sense that we have a duty of care. That Māori are tangata whenua, they are Indigenous New Zealanders. So much of our sense of who we are is derived from that. And, New Zealand is, Māori and New Zealand, we are inextricably linked, of course, by virtue of that. And it's the only place where they are tangata whenua. So that immediately makes us have a duty of care. But at the same time, we're at the moment at a turning point in some incredibly important parts of our relationship. For instance, we have too many Māori children in state care. We have too many Māori in prison. It's a deficit approach, I know, to talk about those things, but that really is an acknowledgement of where the failings have been in our system. We need to address that, acknowledge it, and change it. And it's taken us too long to date. So this is why I'm not one to speak of perfection here, but at least we have a sense of responsibility. I know that much.
TJ asks, are you the leader you want to be, or the leader you have to be, or both?
I sleep at night, so that means I'm the leader I want to be. Do you know, as well as being an idealist, which I am, I'm also a pragmatist. So whilst I have these great hopes and ambitions for what I'd like to do while I'm in the privilege of having this role, I also come from a small town called Morrinsville, and that's probably where I think some of my pragmatism comes from. So I am okay with the idea that transformation takes a bit of time. Because if you want anything to stick in a country with a 3-year electoral cycle, you have to bring people with you. I still remember 10 years ago, in my first year in Parliament, I was sitting in the Nose lobby, which is a sad place to sit. And I was sitting next to our ex-Minister of Finance. And in the debating chamber at that time, there were a series of votes going on which were essentially undermining our emissions trading scheme. And we'd just gone through a series of votes as well on our superannuation scheme that also did something similar. And I just saw the emotion on his face, years of work just gone like that. I think probably some of those experiences made me realise that transformation, for it to be truly transformational as a government, you have to build consensus. People have to actually decide that what you've done needs to stick. Otherwise, it's gone. And so I'm okay with being a pragmatist and taking a bit of time if it means it'll leave a legacy. And so on child poverty and climate change, those are the two areas where I'd love to ensure what we do lasts.
And I wanted to ask you about climate change, because you've said in the past we're small and our contribution to the global emissions profile is even smaller, but nonetheless you want to lead the charge for change. What will it take to get meaningful global action, or will it be country by country, even the small ones, bit by bit?
What will it take? I think a visit to the Pacific Islands might do it.
They're your neighbours.
Yeah, I think we actually just do need to humanise this. I think probably one of the struggles that we have, and acknowledging we have made progress. I mean, when I was a candidate 10 years ago, I still remember being asked in a candidates meeting to speak about my views on climate change, and I spoke in a very noble and impassioned way, only to have the entire hall boo. Including, I suspect, my grandmother, who was in the audience at the time. That was a time where actually people were very open about their climate change denial. So when I think about where we've come in the last 10 years, that we're now actually debating what our action will be in New Zealand as opposed to its existence, then that's a big shift. but I still think we need to humanise this. I think there's we run the risk that climate change can feel like something that's happening to someone else. But if you visit Kiribati or you visit Tuvalu, it is real. This is not a hypothetical. The changes that they're seeing in their natural environment is happening now. So I'd hope that actually, when confronted with that, that might motivate the change that we need, because actually it is going to take country by country action, and it's going to take civil society to keep pushing for it.
I never run over time. I'm always a slave to the clock, but I'm going to crib just 1 minute more, if I may, because a lovely question has come in from a librarian at the City of Melbourne State Library. What are you reading right now?
Oh, my goodness.
It's always a great question.
That is
and
a good
you can
question.
refer to your pile of shame.
I have a massive.
Never gets read.
Are you kidding? I have a bookcase of shame. I read in the summer, and so when I'm not reading in the summer, it takes me a long time. I'm reading Donut Economics at the moment. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
And what are you getting from it?
Oh, it's reinforcing the things that I already believe, of course, because isn't it great in this society where we're all entrenched in our own views and ideas to reinforce ourselves from time to time? Yeah, it's just like skimming Facebook.
And just quickly and finally, no political leader really, it seems, ever willingly and happily walks away from power. They usually have to be dragged out of office. Are you one who you think will know when your time has come, or
I've talked about this before, but the fact that I want my family to tell me when actually it's time for someone else to do this job, because I'm certainly of the view that we've been blessed in New Zealand with a long list of amazing politicians, not all of which who have held the top job. But we are all replaceable. We are. And we have this tradition in the New Zealand Labour Party that when you leave, you get gifted this terrible, I don't know why we still do it, Annie, these silver trays that you do nothing with, but you get this silver tray with an engraving. And we also have a tradition that in the New Zealand Parliament, if a member of Parliament passes away, we all stand and give a minute's silence. And I would have only been in Parliament for maybe about 2 years when a name came up that I didn't recognise. And I'm a political animal. And it was just this little fleeting moment where I thought, one day I'll be a name just in the history book somewhere that, some nerd of politics will recognise. But I don't need to have anyone remember my name. But if they can remember something we did that meant something to someone, if the poverty legislation is still there making a difference for kids, or someone can easily go to their mental health service without even thinking about it, or without even remembering there was a time when that wasn't there, then that's worth 10 silver trays, and it's worth 10 namings in Parliament.
Ladies and gentlemen, please thank the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern.